Okay, welcome everyone to this public lecture hosted by the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. I'm Rui Jia. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at the school and the co-director of our China Data Lab. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Taisu Zhang from Yale Law School. Taisu is a professor of law and expert in legal and economic history. Today, he will talk about his latest book, which is the second of the planned trilogy in exploring how China took a development path different from the other parts of the world, especially Europe. As many of you know, this is coined as the Great Divergence by historians. His new book focuses specifically explaining why the Qing dynasty is weak in terms of physical capacity measured by taxation. This topic, broadly known as state capacity, has attracted attentions from scholars across different fields. We economists are latecomers, as always, to this important topic. I actually also work on related issues. And I certainly believe that to make progress on this important topic, we need to bring together ideas from different fields. The best place for those interested in China to bring ideas together maybe would be the 21st Century China Center public lecture series. That's my advertisement. So we are all looking forward to hearing your thoughts. You have about 40 minutes.
Yes, excellent. So to turn slides, I should just click, right? Oh, so thank you guys for coming to this talk. Thank you, Rachel, for hosting me, and also thank you to the center for facilitating this visit. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you guys here today. This is kind of at the tail end of a pretty long day, so if I begin to sound too weak and not projected enough, please let me know from the back. Otherwise, this is my second book. It came out last year. It's called The Ideological Foundations of Qing Taxation. This is what the cover looks like. So basically, what the cover shows is like a bunch of Qing mandarins sitting at a tea shop in Beijing, looking at Peking opera players play out some kind of historical drama on the top. So for me, this is kind of like a metaphor of what's going on in the book, which is that elites are acting upon stylized and in many cases fictional narratives about history that they built for themselves and told themselves. And that, in my mind, shaped a lot of their policy decisions across the entire course of the dynasty. So the motivation of the book is this observation, which is certainly not unique to me. This is kind of like a common observation across pretty much anyone who's worked on this for the past 15 years, which is that the Qing state, relative to nearly any other comparison that you could throw it into, was a very unusually weak and poor state in fiscal terms. Not necessarily in other terms, but at least in fiscal terms. So to give you kind of a rough sense of the comparisons, if you look at Sino-Japanese comparisons, which are often the most relevant because they kind of have a similar cultural background and a similar structure and so on and so forth. The Meiji states, if you look at post-1870 developments, had a much smaller economy to start with. It was only like a third or a quarter of the Chinese economy. It actually, in absolute terms, accumulated in rapid course something like 2 to 3 times the overall economic resources of the Qing state, and was able to throw that pool of resources into its industrialization push, which sped up that process by quite a lot. If you look at, these are really guesstimates, right? Because our estimates of fiscal income are kind of precise, but even there, because of the existence of informal surcharges and kind of hidden taxes, it's not that precise. But our estimates of GDP are, as everyone knows, kind of like guesstimates, but these are kind of like our best guesstimates based on a wide range of sources. If you look at the share of annual fiscal income as kind of like a share of GDP, which is more or less one of the more intuitive ways to measure kind of how strong a fiscal state was relative to its economy, Japan, even in something like 1860, was over 15%. It was one of the highest tax regimes in the early modern world at that point. And China was pretty much the lowest single one in Eurasia at around 2%. If you only look at agricultural taxes, right? If you strip out things like commercial taxes or salt taxes and so on, and you only look at things, taxes that were collected directly on the basis of agricultural production and farming, then Japan was over 20%. It was a very high tax regime. It took quite a lot out of its farmers, whereas China, for a large part of the 19th century, was actually less than 1% by our best estimates. So it's like a 20-time difference. In fact, if you look at any other early modern pre-industrial regime, China is an extreme outlier, right? So if you look at pretty much like all of Eurasia regimes fall into three major categories in terms of fiscal capacity. There are what you might call like island states, right? So England and Japan, they are consolidated, they have clear boundaries, they're pretty small in size. And because of their greater homogeneity due to their island nature, they have relatively higher taxes. England was in the 10 to 15% range. Japan was about 15%. France was around 8%. Russia 7%. So starting with Russia, the second. So France and maybe possibly like depending on how you see it, Russia fall into a second category, which are kind of like mid-sized European land-based powers. They're not as kind of like maritime as England was. They're larger in land mass for the most part, and they face greater principal agent problems in controlling their tax agents. And so they charge a little bit less tax than the English or the Japanese did, but still it was like 7, 8, 9% more most of the time. Interestingly, if you look at the US around 1850 or like 1860 near the Civil War, it pretty much was in this range as well. You know, federal plus state plus local taxes was, by our best estimates, roughly 8% of GDP. Third category was what you would call large land-based Asiatic empires, right? Russia might fall into this category depending on the phase. The Ottoman Empire certainly was in this phase. And these usually tax somewhere in the range of 5%. Higher end might be 7%, lower end. At various points, the Ottoman Empire fell towards like 4%. So compared to with all of these things, like the Qing would probably certainly fit into like land-based Asiatic empires, but even amongst land-based Asiatic empires, the Qing was an extreme outlier in terms of how much it taxed. The even more surprising thing is the growth trend of agricultural taxes. Right, every single other state at some point in their history, when they're on the cusp of building kind of like what you might call like a modern fiscal state, made an effort to boost the absolute volume, if not necessarily the rate of agricultural taxes, especially if and when the agrarian economy actually expanded. Like if the agrarian economy gave them more room to tax, the states usually were not shy about taking that room. Right? Like if you recognize that your peasants had more cash, well, you would take that cash, at least part of it for yourself. If you were benevolent, you would take it as a kind of like a steady rate. You just keep it to 5%. And then if the economy grows 20%, your overall income grows by 20% as well. The Qing, as far as I can tell, was the only regime that kept the absolute volume of agricultural taxes flat for nearly 200 years. And then the other way of understanding how unique the Qing was is, we just talked about horizontal comparisons. You can also look at this from vertical comparisons. So if you do vertical comparisons and you compare Qing taxes to say Ming taxes or Song taxes or Tang taxes and going all the way back, then looking across Chinese dynasties, and these are not always Han Chinese dynasties, the Tang and the Yuan were not certainly Han Chinese dynasties. These were usually what happens is that at the start of the dynasty, everyone wants to show off benevolence and calm the people after turbulent political transitions. So you keep relatively low agricultural taxes to try to bolster the recovery of your economy. Now, once there is a recovery, and once your politics have stabilized at around mid-dynasty, what you also discover with the growth of the economy and with the growth of the population is that around mid-dynasty, your state capacity, your overall size of your bureaucracy can't keep up with your population or your economy. And so that's usually like the impetus in the mid-Tang and the mid-Song, across the entire Yuan for the most part, and also in the Ming as well, for the state to become more expansion-oriented in taxes. So every single other major dynasty has like a moment somewhere around mid-dynasty where they engage in pretty significant fiscal reform, usually with an eye towards expanding their overall fiscal intake, generally speaking, especially in terms of agriculture. Even the Song was Now, the Song is the only dynasty that did not rely primarily on agricultural taxation for much of its history. But even the Song, right, like before it shifted towards this like commercial tax, indirect taxation mode that it began to have starting in the 11th century, even the Song, as a prelude to building that bureaucratic infrastructure, still increased agricultural taxes, and during the Wang Dynasty period, by quite a lot. Just as kind of simply because they could, right? The peasants were getting wealthier. You don't have to increase the tax rates. Your overall volume of agricultural taxes will just kind of naturally go up. The Qing breaks this pattern, right? The Qing breaks this pattern despite the fact that its overall economy grows pretty much as rapidly as any other dynasty. The size of the agrarian economy triples across the entire dynasty. Per capita income stays pretty much the same, but the population and overall size both triple, which kind of means, if you're counting taxable surplus, it actually triples in volume. But the absolute volume of taxes stays the same, which means that the share of the agrarian economy that the state is taking, in, keeps falling. Right, it starts off at maybe like 4.5% in the early dynasty, falls to 3% by like the late Kangxi Yongzheng era, then falls to like less than 2% by the early 19th century, and falls to like 1% by the end of the dynasty. So the question is, what explains this kind of behavior? Then one final motivating question is, even within the Qing fiscal system, right, the agricultural tax was kind of like a sacred cow. It was an unusually politically untouchable thing. So the Qing, for all its, all our complaints about its fiscal weakness and so on and so forth, was not so different from other dynasties when it came to non-agricultural taxes, especially commercial taxes, but also tariffs, salt taxes, iron taxes, like all kinds of miscellaneous taxes that it charged. So if you look at those taxes, right, the Qing was kind of like a rational state, like rational fiscal state. When the size of the non-agricultural economy grew, they extracted more taxes. The overall tax rate kind of kept stable from 1650 to the 1840s. And then from 1840s onwards, right, because of the Taiping and all the massive demand that the Taiping placed on government finances, commercial taxes just skyrocketed, right? So basically, the state was not averse to raising taxes. It very aggressively raised all kinds of other taxes. It just adamantly refused to raise agricultural taxes. And they say this multiple times during the dynasty. Zheng Guofan has this very famous quote that the merchants have infinite profit. You can tax them however much you want. The peasants don't, and so therefore we can't tax the peasants. And so pretty much that actually was Qing policy for pretty much the entire dynasty. So to just give you guys like a very short run through of what actually happened here. So there was some turbulence after the Manchu conquest. So there was like a very early Qing attempt right after the conquest to just cut all the late Ming surcharges, reverse a lot of even the economic single whip reforms that Zhang Zhudong had made, and then just go to very low taxes. So what they discovered soon after that was that was too low, they had cut too much. And the government just couldn't function at such a low tax base. So they gradually snuck back in some of the late Ming surcharges under various discrete titles. And by something like 1680, 1690, the overall volume of agricultural taxes had kind of stabilized around what you would call kind of like the late Ban Li era red line. So the elites perceived a certain kind of like red line that was set in the late Ban Li era, right after the imposition, so there were three major agricultural tax surcharges imposed in the Ming. So the state drew the line at we can have the first of these, but the latter two are too much. So they drew the line right after the first surcharge was imposed, and said, okay, we're not going to go beyond this like late Ban Li maximum. And so in terms of absolute value, this was around 30 million taels of silver every single year. So from then on, from around 1680 all the way until pretty much 1900, 212 years of time, the absolute volume of agricultural taxes remains pretty much locked in place. There was one moderate expansion around 1725 during the Yongzheng Huahao reforms, which itself triggered a political backlash so large that it further solidified the state's commitment towards not raising agricultural taxes. In some ways, that really was the exception that kind of proves the rules. Now, at this point, I think any Chinese historian worth his or her salt will tell you, okay, aren't you looking only at formal taxes, like what the government actually reports? If you look at that, then sure, like the government the government's formal tax quota stays at 30 million taels for pretty much the entire dynasty. But what if you count informal taxes, right? All these like low things that were going up. So it turns out that we have sources on these too. We have at least three relatively good counts of the overall size of informal taxes across the entire dynasty. There was kind of like a late Kangxi era count done by the state as part of the lead up to the Yongzheng Houhao reforms. There was a early 19th century count done by this guy called Zhou Jian, who's at Beijing Normal University right now, and him and also a bunch of data from Taisu Zhang collide to give kind of like a picture of the actual overall tax rates, including informal taxes that you saw in like mid-Qing Jiangnan. And then you have like a late Qing count by Wang Yejian, which is kind of the most thorough one that was based on Qing official accounting of informal surcharges at the provincial level or below in the late Qing. So the interesting thing is all three counts yield pretty much the same picture, which is that informal taxes were more or less 100% of the formal taxes. And because formal taxes pretty much stayed the same, the overall informal taxes may have fluctuated a little bit here and there, but overall in rough volume, they didn't experience anything close to real substantial heavy growth. So the stability of Qing agricultural taxes is even true after we count informal taxes. In the meantime, as I just told you guys, the economy and population both more or less tripled, right? And after 1850, the state was plunged into pretty much nonstop fiscal crisis because of the Taiping. And so it was facing immense shortfalls. And in response to that, it chose to increase taxes on commercial and industrial production almost 3- to 4-fold. But agriculture was completely, basically kept immune from those tax increases. And you can say maybe that was because they could actually make do. They had enough income just by increasing commercial taxes. But I think like if you know anything about Qing fiscal history, that clearly wasn't the case, right? The commercial and tariff increases and this like industrial production taxes were growing as pretty much as they possibly could. The state was like basically taxing these guys at the breaking point, and still like there were clear signs of fiscal stress all through the late 19th century. That probably could have been alleviated had they actually raised the agricultural taxes, but they insisted on not doing that. So no matter how much fiscal duress they are under, prior to like 1905, they just adamantly say we can't raise the agricultural tax. So then this begins to beg the question of what's going on here, right? So the previous picture kind of shows you like there are three major challenges that you want to face when you're looking at the Qing agricultural tax or the Qing fiscal regime. The first question is in absolute terms, why was it weak in general terms? The second was why was it unusually weak compared to other Chinese dynasties? Because when comparing to other Chinese dynasties, you begin to see like a bit of a different picture, like what made the Qing different from, say, the Ming. And the third most interesting thing is what gives the agricultural tax a different kind of political stature compared to the non-agricultural tax? Why can you raise one but not the other? So there are three major explanations given by people who work on this kind of stuff over the past couple of years for why the Qing state didn't actually raise taxes. So these are mainly given by political scientists and economists. So these are all kind of like rational actor model theories, one way or the other. So there are a bunch of guys who say the Qing state didn't really need to raise agricultural taxes. This is our friend Bin Wang, for example. The second, there's a bunch of people who say that they don't really have the capacity to do so. Say like Ma Lebin, Tuang Hiseng, Shaki Moriguchi, and so on and so forth, have made arguments to this effect recently to say that like even if the Qing wanted to raise agricultural taxes, it didn't have either the political possibility of doing so, i.e., peasants would actually rebel if they raised agricultural taxes, or there would be some kind of like administrative collapse of some kind that will prevent them from actually doing so. The third kind of explanation, actually, this is a kind of a mistype. There's a third kind of explanation where, for example, if you've read Wang Yuhua's recent book, the Rise and Fall of Imperial China, he gives us an explanation which basically is based on the self-interest of elites, and that local elites themselves that didn't want the state to raise taxes. And given that local elites kept getting more and more powerful relative to the central governments across the Ming and Qing, their resistance made sure that the state did not increase agricultural taxes. Then there's kind of like a fourth explanation, which historians favor. So like Matty Zellin, Bill Rose, Susan Mann, and so on and so forth, they tend to think it's because of Confucianism. We're going to go through these one by one. So the first category is pretty much the most popular, right? So there's a large literature saying that because the Chinese state fought fewer wars, it was under less fiscal pressure than its European peers, Ben Wang, Philip Hoffman, Walter Scheidel, so on and so forth. Obvious problem with this is that after 1840, no matter what you think of the theory, can't really apply post 1840, but the phenomenon of the Qing state refusing to raise agricultural taxes goes past 1840. It probably can't really explain pre-1780 stuff either, because pre-1780, the Qing was fighting all these massive campaigns in Central Asia, and those were costly too, right? So the Qing only didn't fight major military campaigns. Between 1780 and 1840, even in between there was the White Lotus Rebellion, which also was incredibly costly, and it was a military campaign. It also can't really explain the Sino-Japanese comparison, because if we're talking about peacefulness, well, Japan was frankly more peaceful than China was, right? And Japan had far higher taxes than China had. Second category is the Qing state lacked the administrative capacity to raise taxes. Now, this comes in simple forms or more complex forms. The simple form is kind of like, basically, if the Qing state had raised agricultural taxes, peasants actually would have rose up and killed them all, and so the state was aware of that and just didn't do that. The more complex form, which is Gerald Rubin, Madobin, Singapore, Gucci, is that the size of the empire created principal agent problems that caution against tax hikes. Didn't necessarily make them politically ruinous if you actually did that, but it would certainly make them more costly if you did. Hence, tax rate goes down with political expansion. The former, I think it's just wrong. Why? Well, because there was at the tail end of the dynasty an actual agricultural tax hike after 1903. And that was pretty much the point where the dynasty was at its administratively weakest. It was also at a point where the peasants were probably more likely to rise up and kill the dynasty anyway. So they finally raised taxes, and then, miracle of miracles, the peasants just shrug it off, right? The dynasty collapses afterwards, but that was because our main theories of the 1911 revolution have nothing to do with tax revolts. It's like an elite-led federalism kind of driven decentralization driven kind of narrative nowadays, right? So no one thinks that tax revolts had much to do with the collapse of the dynasty, and there were very few of them. So if the idea, plus afterwards, across the 1920s and 30s, all these warlord governments, all these Republican governments come in, they raise agricultural taxes super aggressively too, even far beyond the late Qing threshold. The peasants never really rebel. They just kind of take it in stride. Why? Because tax rates were so low to begin with that even if you increase them by 200%, the peasants could actually still afford to pay them. So we have clear historical counter narratives in the 20th century of states raising agricultural taxes successfully. And frankly, all of these states were administratively weaker and politically less secure than what the mid-Qing was. So it seems very unlikely that if the Qing could raise taxes without triggering a peasant rebellion in 1907, it can't do so in 1760. Right. The second is very useful. I think it's partially right, but it's also incomplete. There are complex reasons for why it's incomplete. This is probably not like an economist-heavy audience except for Horacio. So I'm not going to go into detail here. We can discuss it later on if you want to know more about this. Then there's the self-interest of Qing political elites. Maybe they just don't want to pay taxes themselves. Maybe they care about keeping their land away from the government's prying hands. Now, there's a difficulty with this, right? In terms of agricultural taxes, as we all know, political elites enjoy pretty significant tax breaks compared to the common man. So they had very good success abating, especially the agricultural taxes. More importantly, starting from around 1800, right? Most of these elite families have huge amounts of money and frankly, huge amounts of manpower, including lots of their sons, invested in commerce. Right, so if you think that their self-interest was the driving factor, it's very hard to explain why their resistance wasn't able to cut off the Qing state's ability to raise commercial taxes, but somehow was able to cut off their ability to raise agricultural taxes. Because frankly, by this point, most of them have more to lose from a commercial tax hike than they do from an agricultural one. And frankly, they actually did lose quite a lot during the commercial tax hikes of the late Qing. So if their self-interest is the driving factor, and you have to assume their ability to resist the state is pretty much constant, then why one but not the other? Just doesn't seem to make a ton of sense. So The end result of looking at all of this is that we probably want to think the Qing state had very large incentives, especially probably before 1780, but also certainly after like 1840 or so, to raise agricultural taxes. It almost certainly had the ability to do so for large swaths of its history, not necessarily every single point of its history, but large swaths. Certainly, for example, 1760, 1820, 1870, 1880, these were all points where I think, like looking at this the way that I do, the Qing state clearly had the ability to raise agricultural taxes had it chose to do that. It never chose to do that. So what's left in terms of possible explanations? Well, now we're down to like the Maggie's Ellen, Bill Rose, Susan Mann kind of explanation. Was it Confucianism? Was there some kind of Confucian bias against taxing farmers and peasants? Against everyone knows this famous phrase, 君子不言利, right? 君子不言利, 君子喻于义, 小人喻于利, right? And so like the idea is the gentleman does not seek a profit because it's below him to do so. There is a tradition in Confucianism that just kind of sees the state, 与民争利, competing for profits with the people as kind of like a yucky thing, right? It's frowned upon, it makes people morally anxious. Maybe that was the reason, like maybe that Confucian tradition of like looking down upon the state, groping for money, was the main reason here. Well, if that were the case, I mean, if it's just because of Confucianism, well, the Qing's not necessarily any more Confucian than any previous dynasty was, right? It's certainly those Tang, Song, Ming, especially the Song and Ming, never stopped any of these previous dynasties from raising taxes when they needed to, right? So what changed in the Qing? Right? And here, I think the intuitive answer for a lot of people would be to say, okay, well, obviously the answer is the Qing's Manchu, right? It's a conquest dynasty imposed from outside, so the foundations of its rule would have been weaker. Now, there are two, I think, obvious problems with this. First of all, I've read a lot. I can't guarantee that I've read every single major memorial related to tax over the dynasty, but I had very good RAs combing the first historical archive for me in Beijing over 2 years. We read like over 1,000 memorials, and we read a bunch of like private essays as well. People don't talk about Manchu rule as a major explanatory factor for why you can't raise agricultural taxes. You could think maybe this is because they weren't allowed to talk about Manchu rule in that way. Well, they talk about Manchu rule as a reason for why you can't do all kinds of other things. Why you have to manage Han-Banner relations in a certain kind of way, or why you can't put troops in certain parts of Jiangnan and so on and so forth. So there was open discussion of Manchu rule across a lot of these sources, just not in the agricultural tax context, which makes me think it's not because they didn't dare say this, it's because they actually didn't think that was the main reason. The second reason, the second problem with this claim is that if it's because of Manchu rule, right? The Manchus, no matter what you think of the New Qing history, you got to admit, like even Mark Gilbert admits this, Manchu rule gets more and more entrenched over time, right? The Manchus are in a stronger position by 1750 than they were in 1845, right? So if that's the case, then the incentive to keep taxes low to avoid Han-Chinese rebellion would have like gradually decreased over time. Not to say it would have disappeared, but it would have gotten weaker over time. The interesting thing about Qing fiscal conservatism, like their insistence you absolutely can't raise agricultural taxes, is that it actually gets stronger over time, right? The consequences for even suggesting an agricultural tax hike get steadily more dire over time. In the early dynasty, you could propose this and you'd be shouted down, but you wouldn't get punished. By 1790, if you proposed an agricultural tax hike in any way, that usually was the end of your career right there. You'd get sacked, you get punished, you get demoted, and in some cases you would actually bear, at least in one case, there was actually criminal punishment attached to it. So what can I say? Like, if you use something that's most likely weakening over time to explain something that's, by all indications, strengthening over time, there's a bit of a logical problem there. And it makes you think you want something else on top of that. I'm not saying Manchu rule didn't matter. Manchu rule clearly mattered in the Yuan dynasty, but it can't have been the only explanation for this. So now I'm on to like my core, like my personal story. And so to understand this story, you have to understand, ideologies. So my story is an ideological one, hence the title of the ideological foundations of Qing taxation. Ideologies have two dimensions, right? They have a normative dimension and they have what you might call kind of like a pragmatic empirical dimension. So the normative dimension is when the ideology tells you, right, this is what you ought to value in life. So communism tells you you ought to value the rise of the proletariat, you ought to value communal equality, real equality, and so on and so forth. Liberalism tells you you ought to value liberty, so on and so forth. Nationalism tells you you ought to value the strength of the state. The pragmatic empirical dimension, so basically the normative dimension tells you what you want. The empirical dimension tells you how you get there, right? Like what are the steps you got to take? Like how you see the world around you. Like, given the world around you, what are the causes and effects of various kinds of moves so that you can best design the strategy that's actually going to get you to your promised land. So if the ideology only really becomes politically salient in terms of normative messages, right? Like the only thing the ideology does is tell you something's moral and something's not. Then I think we can all agree that politicians maybe are not completely immune to that kind of thing, but they're not that seriously constrained just by somebody telling you that something's morally wrong, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be politicians, right? But the message becomes much stronger when the normative and the empirical dimensions work together, right? So when you can tell me that something is not just morally right or morally wrong, but doing something is in my own interests, then all of a sudden the message begins to stick much more aggressive. When you can shape my perception of the world to make me think that doing something will be disastrously bad out of raw self-interest, that if doing something will kill me, then that's a much stronger message than just like doing something that's morally wrong. So what I want to say basically is that the nature of Confucian ideology against raising agricultural taxes changed between the late Ming and the Qing. That's the first step of this argument, which is that there's a kind of like a Ming-Qing shock, Ming-Qing transition shock, that made elites go from a message where in the late Ming, when you talk about the reasons why you can't raise taxes, the conservatives would basically generally say, like raising taxes is morally bad, it makes us anxious, we fear these consequences, but because of our kind of like a lack of a clear historical precedent, we can't tell you exactly what would happen if you raise taxes. We just think it might be bad, but we don't know for sure. And then the response from people like Taisu Zhang or Hai Rui or even Gao would say, like, well, the moral stuff can be argued both ways. And second, your examples of history can be counterbalanced with other examples from distant history. We don't think that raising taxes is going to have this kind of like dire outcome. There was no settled discourse on what raising taxes would actually do to you. The only settled discourse was that raising taxes was kind of morally wrong. But that, again, never matches up. Zhang Zhang professes quite a bit of moral anxiety about raising taxes, but he ends up doing it anyway because he thinks that the dynasty needs it. So that message, or your main reason for not wanting to raise taxes is like moral anxiety, sets the tone, right? And because that's the main nature of like late Ming fiscal anti-tax arguments, it's heavier on the moral side than on the empirical production side. That never really works out very well, right? The fiscal reformists and expansionists win the day most of the time when the dynasty really needs money. But then the claim is that all changes from the Ming to the Qing. By the early Qing, the message really is, frankly, we don't even care if raising taxes is morally wrong. Like, we still think it's morally wrong, but that's not the point. The point is raising taxes is going to kill you. Why do we know that it's going to kill you? Well, because the Ming showed you what would happen if you raise taxes. Right, the Ming gives you a vivid example of what would happen if you raise taxes beyond a certain red line. The peasants' tolerance for your taxes breaks, they rise up, and they kill you. So that's the tone of pretty much every single major argument against taxation in the early Qing. It's no longer raising taxes is morally wrong. Raising taxes is morally wrong. We thought it would be bad. Now we have proof. Now we know exactly what it's going to do. We don't think our economy is any better than the Ming's. In fact, in the early Qing, probably will be weaker than the Ming's. And if they had a red line for beyond which they couldn't step, well, by God, we better stick to that. Like we better keep to the right side of that red line ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to die too. And so again, as you can imagine, raising taxes will kill you is a hell of a lot stronger message than just raising taxes is frowned upon by Confucius. Right. So this is kind of like a summary of just that, right? So for example, if you look at the Huangmingjing Shibenbian, there are all kinds of examples where people say, and yeah, we think raising taxes is just normatively bad. We're kind of wishy-washy on the consequences, but we think it's just morally bad, and you shouldn't do it. That doesn't work. Early Qing taxes, like early Qing, within 5 years, within 10 years of the Ming collapse, within 10 years of the Qing entering into power, pretty much every single major writer that I can track down, the guys who opened this out, like the guys who all argued over this in court, the prominent intellectuals like Wu Huang Zongxi who wrote about this in their private writings, Wang Fuzhi came in later as well, Yan Yuan, Li Gong, all these guys coalesce around a single message, which is that we knew raising taxes was morally bad, and sure enough, once Ming taxes went beyond a reasonable limit, the peasant rebellions killed off. And so, if you want to avoid the same fate, you better stick to that red line as well. So that's, I think, what happened in the early Ming, late Ming, early Qing, right? There was a dynastic shock that produced in many ways like an unprecedented shock to the elite psyche that made them see the world in a different way. Previously, at most, when they thought about taxes, they thought about it in pragmatic terms. We need the money, or maybe morally anxious about what the peasants might do, but we don't have like a clear idea. Because prior to the Ming, the thing is, all these other dynasties collapsed. You think of why they collapsed, at least in the official Chinese narrative, right? The Yuan collapses because they're Mongol barbarians. That's the official verdict given to them in the Yuan Shi. The Song collapses because of Mongol conquest. The Tang collapses because of military fiefdoms, right? And so does the Han. So none of these things, like some of these dynasties are weakened by peasant rebellion, like the Huangzhou rebellion, the Huangtao rebellion, so that they're severely weakened by them. But they usually overcome the peasant rebellions, and then they died of fiscal. They died of military fiefdoms a couple of years later. So a lot of the political wisdom of these early dynasties was more targeted, as you see in the Song, especially towards controlling fiefdoms than toward anything else, right? The Ming was the first dynasty to unequivocally, clearly collapse in the eyes of elites because of peasant rebellions. And this is, the peasants go into Beijing, sack the city, force children to commit suicide. It's almost impossible to overstate how big a shock that was on the elite psyche post-transition. Prior to the transition, there was genuine division amongst the elites over whether state expansion was a good thing or a bad thing. Zhang Zhang would say, yeah, state expansion might burden the peasants more heavily in the short run, but over the long run, we can do good things with the money that will benefit everyone. It's kind of like a Ming Chinese version of like a welfare state arguments, right? Then there are people who are more conservative and say the state should remain small. By the early Qing, nearly everyone who writes like a theory of the state, Wang Fuzhi, so on and so forth, comes to the consensus. The state should be as small as humanly possible. It's a necessary evil that we tolerate out of bare necessity, and you want to keep the state as small as possible. So that's really the shift. But there was a seismic shift in how elites perceived the state after the Ming-Qing transition. Now, okay, so that I think explains a lot of the early Qing reluctance to raise taxes. It explains why they cut taxes so severely. It explains why they're so hesitant to do all kinds of things. But then, no matter how big the shock, time heals everything, right? So the early Qing shock can't possibly explain elite behavior 200 years down the road. It might have like a vague influence on that from time to time, but it can't have been like the most dominant reason. So the question then is, well, okay, so if the Ming-Qing transition was the catalyst that turned early Qing elites towards this like anti-fiscal expansion mentality, then what explains the longevity of that idea across so much political terrain, across the entire history of this dynasty? Like the Qing goes through massive ups and downs, twists and changes in fortune quite a lot. And the only thing that seems to never waver is its commitment to not raising agricultural taxes. So here the claim is that basically, the anti-taxation bias, the anti-agricultural taxation bias was actually institutionally self-perpetuating in some pretty interesting ways, right? So this argument is complicated. I can only give you guys like a very crude summary here, but the argument is this. The Qing is the only major dynasty in Chinese history to never conduct a nationwide land survey. In every other previous Chinese dynasty, no matter what you thought of taxes per se, no one had much of a beef with doing land surveys. The idea was land surveys could only lead to more justice. It would allow you to allocate taxes more equitably. It would give you more information about your economic circumstances. That's like no one really has much of a strong argument against land against doing land surveys. So every dynasty does them, right? Usually they do them as preparation for tax hikes, but they also do them from time to time, even when that's not related. The Qing never does a nationwide land survey. Not only does it never do a nationwide land survey, starting from like the 1860s, and this becomes formally enshrined in the Qing Code from I think around 1736 onwards, it actually bans provincial level land survey. And so the only possible land survey that could be done would have to come from the imperial court. And the imperial court never ordered a nationwide land survey. Now, what happens when you never do a nationwide land survey? Well, the politically correct version of how large you think your economy is gets locked in place. Now, that's not to say that kind of like mythical, it's like 1640 figure of how much land there was in the empire. Everyone doesn't necessarily believe that. Like starting from the 1780s onwards, you begin to see divergences and some private rights away from this. But the thing is, when you think about the politics of arguing for tax hikes, if you want to argue for a tax hike against the conventional wisdom of pretty much the entire imperial court, you know that you're risking mockery, shame, possible banishment, demotion. You'd better make sure that you have some ironclad reasons for arguing why we can actually afford to raise taxes and not have the peasants killed. So basically, the only way you can do this is to have completely reliable figures showing that there is actually excess production in the rural economy that can make the peasants withstand a tax increase. It's not good enough to say, I went out into the countryside, I observed this, I think there's excess land. That's never a good enough political argument, right? Politics does not run on anecdotal information that you gather on your own. It doesn't run on common sense. It doesn't run on personal experience. Politics runs, especially in these like large centralized states. We can talk about this later. Even today, it's the same thing. Politics runs on authoritative information that's been verified by authoritative sources. Now, when pretty much the only way that you can produce authoritative information on how much economic produce there was in the rural economy refuses to update itself, it becomes very, very hard for anyone daring to make a political argument that there was excess production to bear the negative to brave the negative consequences of making that argument, right? It becomes like nearly insurmountable. So what that means is it's not necessarily intellectually crippling across the entire elite. That's crazy. That's too much of a claim. But it does make it nearly politically impossible to make a credible claim at court that raising taxes will not kill us. That the peasants will actually tolerate more taxes. It's not possible until land surveys finally begin to return in kind of this very piecemeal fashion at the very tail end of the dynasty. So in fact, like this refusal to do a land survey creates all kinds of like weird discourses, right? So for the entire second half of the Qing, the imperial government is firmly persuaded that the Qing government is locked into this Malthusian crisis. You guys must be familiar with this in some ways. Hong Liangjie, for example, is very famous for arguing about this kind of thing. The elites really believe we face a deep, incredibly deep Malthusian crisis. We know that our population has tripled. We know because we keep doing population censuses, but we also know that the overall land in the empire has a fixed value. It can't go beyond a certain limit. We think we've already hit that limit, and so by logic, we must have hit a Malthusian crisis. Now, interesting. So this is dominant political discourse, the high-level political discourse. Interestingly, every single economic historian who studied the mid-Qing and later tells you, there was no Malthusian crisis. Right? This is like nearly conventional wisdom across economic historians these days. There might have been even if there was like a dip, it was a very shallow dip. And for the most part, living standards were pretty much the same across the entire late Qing. There was no growth either. There was no increase in living standards, but there wasn't much of a decrease either. So there was no Malthusian crisis, which kind of begs the question, why were high-level political elites so persuaded that there was a Malthusian crisis? Well, frankly, it's because they see the population growth in authoritative figures, but they don't see the growth in economic capacity on the ground, right? Now, you could ask, well, why can't they just go on the ground and see that there's excess production, you got to think, right? Like the Qing state is quite distant from its peasantry. Would the peasantry have ever voluntarily told the state we have more production? Of course not, right? Because that would be inviting tax hikes. The Qing state the peasantry will only give up information if the state forces it to do so. Now, how does the state force the peasantry to volunteer information? It's by land surveys. So if you don't do land surveys, what is your mean of accurately knowing what's going on the ground? It is quite possible across human history for either elites or the population to have mistaken perceptions of the economy for very long periods of time. It happened in the 1920s and 30s. It's actually happening right now in the US as well. And you would say, okay, right now it's only happened for a couple of months, but like back in the 1930s and 20s and 30s and 40s, there was a dominant elite perception that like veering away from the gold standard would lead to economic ruin. And that was an empirical belief that was mistaken for decades and decades and decades. So this is not just limited to the Qing context, right? Like widespread mistaken empirical beliefs about the nature of the economy are not so uncommon across human history. Now, then the question becomes, well, why did they actually going back one slide? Whoops. Why did they actually never do a land survey? Like, what made them not do it? Well, so if you read the sources, what they'll say is, well, we can't do a land survey for the same reasons that we can't raise agricultural taxes. Why? Because we're so deathly afraid of peasants that, well, if you do a land survey, the peasants will know that it's very likely that the land survey is like a run-up. It's like a preparation for a tax hike. So if you think that they're going to rebel once you do a tax hike, then you better not even do a land survey because they're so overtaxed already. They're so basically hitting the absolute limit of their tolerance for you already that even a land survey would disturb them so much that they might actually rebel. Like memorial after memorial, edict after edict, starting from the Kangxi era onwards, says this. No, we can't. If I want to know the actual state of like anything, I can't connect that information to taxes. This is why the Qing could actually continue to count population, because from the early Qing onwards, population was no longer linked to taxes. Kangxi says this in his edict for why he doesn't want to, like, in his very famous Yongbujiafu edict in 1712, he says it's very clear. One of the reasons why I don't want to ever again raise the head tax, I don't want to link the population figures to taxation anymore, is I wish to know the actual size of my population. The underlying message being that had we still taxed population, had we still taxed heads, we couldn't have actually done even a population survey because that was linked to taxation. So there's this like dialogue across like the early mid-Qing, and you can't do this, even this. So the combination of these things, like the early Ming Qing, the early Qing shock because of Ming collapse, paired with this like self-inflicted informational kind of like self-mutilation, to me creates this like self-perpetuating myth of a constantly overtaxed populace that made the elites constantly afraid of taxing. So wrapping this up, so how did this entire thing actually end? Well, basically, it was pure desperation after 1900, right? So after Shimonoseki, after the Boxer Rebellion, astronomical war indemnities to foreign powers specifically forced them. Like they're completely on the verge of collapse. The commercial taxes are completely inadequate to actually meet this, and they began to think, okay, maybe we can. Let's try to we're gonna be dead anyway if we don't do this. So why don't we see if we can squeeze some extra cash out of the peasantry? So finally, they began to do like a series of like baby land surveys. In the late 19th century, they do a nationwide fiscal survey in 1907, followed by finally a tentative hike in agricultural taxes, about 30%, for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Elites expected disaster, none came. So, which meant that once this happens, right, the entire myth is broken. Right? If you think that peasants would rise up to kill you if you raise taxes, well, here's an example: you raise taxes, the peasants didn't seem to give a darn. So why don't we do it over and over again? Right, so every regime that comes after, right, all these Republican regimes that were arguably weaker or as weak as the Qing administratively learned the lesson that we can actually afford to raise taxes because the peasants will tolerate it. So by the mid 1930s, agricultural taxes are 3.5 times what they were in the late Qing, and the lesson learned by the PRC is pretty much the same. And by the 1950s, agricultural taxes are literally 10 times higher than what they were in the late Qing. So what this means is that really it was the perception this misperception that the peasantry will kill you if you raise taxes. It really was doing the heavy lifting in Qing politics. Once that myth is broken, once there is a successful example of raising taxes and the peasantry not killing you, then everyone begins to raise taxes, and the peasantry is kind of screwed. So what are the advantages of this account, right? So unlike the previous accounts, this actually does explain everything that happened post 1840, right? Why do you not increase taxes even after 1840? Because you think you're even weaker. There was the Taiping, the Taiping is a peasant rebellion. Like you think the peasants are again revolting because they're being pushed to the limit. So therefore, if you think you can't raise agricultural taxes before 1840, after the Taiping, you certainly can't raise it anymore afterwards. So they stick to low taxes no matter what. It explains why they raise commercial taxes, because this entire dialogue of how the Ming collapsed is because of agricultural taxes, right? The peasants killed the Ming, not the merchants. It explains the vertical uniqueness of the Qing and helps with horizontal uniqueness. This is fairly obvious, right? Like none of the pre-Qing dynasties had the benefit of this like Ming collapse as a catalyst, so they don't have this kind of thing. And it also explains in many ways like why Manchu rulers and the Manchu literati were actually more pro-taxation than their Han Chinese counselors, because the Han Chinese counselors feel the impact of this kind of thing much more obviously in the early Qing. That their faith and their politics, their governance was shaken much more than the Manchus. The Manchus were kind of newcomers to this entire thing. So very often in the early Qing, you see like Manchu bannermen, people like Jinfu, for example, or Han bannermen, proposing tax hikes, and they get shouted down by the Han Chinese officials at court. And this also kind of runs opposite to what you would expect if the real overwhelmingly dominant political motivation was just like the Manchu rulers' sense of vulnerability themselves. So it has a lot of benefits that the previous accounts don't have. I'm not saying this is the complete account, right? But I'm saying that at least at the very least, you ought to add this account to the previous ones, so that you have kind of like a more holistic picture. And then all of a sudden, like the uniqueness of the Qing fiscal state begins to become more understandable and comprehensible. Then this is like a bunch of theoretical jargon that I'm not going to get to you guys, because I think this is more of a historical crowd. But again, like the gold standard, the post-2008 European austerity, sovereign debt crisis management, so on and so forth, it shows you this kind of empirical misperception about the road that's shaped by ideology, that's shaped by ideological politics, is certainly not unique to the Qing context. If you really look for examples of this across world history, across modern world history, you'd find lots of examples. And some of them were every bit as crippling as the Qing example. That said, the Qing, I think, was one example of this. And that's my explanation for why it taxed. So, all right, thank you.
I want to say that our UCSD library bought electronic copy of this book so that each of you can read it. The hard copy so far is still priced very high at Amazon. So yeah, I hope in the next few months there will be some relatively affordable.
The paperback comes out, I think, in a
Okay,
so it should be okay.
Great. We'll have time for some questions.
Yes,
I know. Do we have online questions?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the online.
Okay.
I got it here.
So ideas matter.
Yeah.
Belief systems matter. I mean, that's something that people studying political science also have been looking at. But the question is, what is the specific mechanism or sometimes institutionally entrenched mechanism that make sure that certain ideas that have formed get disseminated and then sometimes enforced. And in other words, ideas don't just permeate.
Yes,
right?
yes.
They don't just diffuse.
Yes.
So can you give us some more details about in the Qing dynasty throughout this 300 years?
Yeah.
What are there academies? Are there party schools? Are there elite social networks that make sure that these ideas permeate and then have such a lock on people's mind?
Yeah. So what I would say is this, right? So the reason why I call it an ideological story, right? Because you could say maybe these stories of the Ming collapse being driven by high taxes are actually true, right? I think a lot of historians nowadays would doubt whether that's completely true or not. But the reason why it's true is, you think of every single major crisis in human history. Once the crisis passes, there's a rush to make sense of it. This happens in the US post-2008. I think most obviously, there's a rush of economists trying to explain what happened in 2008. And the thing is, right, if it's purely neutral academic discourse, intellectuals don't usually tend to agree with each other, organically speaking. As you said, there has to be some kind of top-down position. There has to be some kind of party in position. The unusual thing about the early Qing narrative of why Ming collapse was triggered by tax increases was that it was bottom-up and nearly unanimous, right? So as far as I can tell, like this was a point where the state had no capacity to permeate messages, didn't have much control over what the literati actually thought at this point. Like people just come to this consensus themselves. There's a rush in the wake of Ming collapse to make sense of the tragedy, to kind of get some kind of usable wisdom. And so that entire process, that politically charged process where everyone's feeling super high amounts of pressure to make sense of the entire thing, then they begin to reach for the ideological priors, right? Now, what are their ideological, what are their priors? Well, the priors are that there's something morally wrong with taxes, right? And so it's kind of like a confirmation bias story. Now, the reason why I'm saying it's like an ideological story is that if it were just elites responding rationally to something, to facts, then you would expect them to like splinter between different factions and spend like decades, if not centuries, working it out amongst themselves. The Qing elite coalesce around this one message, the Ming collapse because of high taxes, within basically like 10 years of the collapse.
That may even be possible, but then there's this intergenerational sort of
Yes.
increment of this set of ideas.
Yes, and this would
Kind of somewhat ossified. So
Yes.
that's the part that's mystifying.
Yeah. So then the claim is once you have a paradigm, and so this initial burst of like, meeting of minds creates kind of like a paradigm, right? The thing that I want to say about ideologies is that ideologies don't give themselves up to like falsification voluntarily, but changing virtues. They have to be kind of like forcibly extracted. And in this particular case, right, the ideology, so the politics of changing a politically dominant ideology have to be, you need super strong evidence of why the ideology is wrong to prove it's wrong. This is kind of like a Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift, right? Like a regular trickle of countervailing evidence is not enough to overcome. It has to be like an overwhelming, authoritative leap into like a new empirical world. Now the thing is, because you don't survey land, it's very hard to make that leap, right? Because you don't survey land, like you're like, regardless of what you think on ground, and there's, I think, evidence that even most elites in 1820, when they wrote about like the size of the Chinese economy, they still cited like official imperial figures from 1680. To like authoritative information is not the same thing as regular information, right? When authoritative information doesn't update itself, it's the politics of overcoming the paradigm becomes incredibly hard, because you're risking, again, like as I was saying, like you're risking your neck by trying to overcome this paradigm, right? The other guys will find someone to destroy you if you can't persuade them. Now, when would you actually risk your neck? It's when you think you have irrefutable evidence that they're all going to accept. Now, what is usually the kind of information like that? It's when the information has like an inherent authority to it. Now, the only entity capable of producing like inherently authoritative information on how large the economy is in the Qing was the state. Like no one else was large enough to have the capacity to actually do so. You can't overturn the paradigm by scattered local anecdotes. You have to overturn it at the core. So when the state consciously refuses to update its own information and permeates this top-down discourse of the Malthusian myth, the Malthusian crisis, the politics of overturning the paradigm become very costly. Besides, when you pair it with punishments, when anyone who raises the possibility of raising agricultural taxes gets sent off into Xinjiang or gets demoted, you can think, right, how much courage would it take for some Qing official to stand up in court or send a memorial to the emperor, let's raise taxes. Even if it was like a palace memorial, it would still be read by more than one eye. And the emperor himself was kind of hostile to this idea, right? So you better have facts like behind you. How do you have the facts behind it when the state refuses to give you those facts? So it's not just about like the mindset, it's also about the self-interest, right? Like you don't stick your neck out to change a paradigm unless either you're desperate, like they were in the very late Qing, or alternatively, you think you're safe. And for pretty much the entire mid-Qing, no one was ever desperate nor safe, right? They had reasons to raise taxes, but they weren't desperate, and then they were never safe. So I think that was the reason.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. As somebody who doesn't even like to do his own taxes, I found like listening to this really fascinating and all the implications really fascinating. I guess my question is kind of about trying to reconcile what you've explained to me with the kind of generic version of late Imperial China that I have. I have a very different take on Matty Zellen's book, The Magistrate Tale, and what's it all about.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought it was about Confucianism. I thought it was about the difficulties of building state capacities in localities. The difficulties because so much of the money is siphoned off. So if you raise taxes, by the time it reaches Beijing, it's been stepped on. Is that the expression? So many times there's very little of the money left. So I guess maybe one way to ask this question is, it sounded like you had a powerful team of people at the #1 archive doing all kinds of stuff at the top, from the top down. But what sort of, how did you look at your problem from the bottom up?
Good.
The problem of building state capacity at the local level is being kind of at least as much a driver as these ideological commitment to raising taxes.
So I think that the most direct answer I can get to that question is, I mean, this is a book about central level policy making, right? It's about why regardless of the actual practices on the ground, it's about why the guys at the top never made that call to expand agricultural taxes until like the last couple of years of the dynasty. Now, that is not immune from local influences, right? They're constantly sensitive towards all kinds of local influences, but local influences have to be processed through central minds to actually take effect. But they don't take effect on central politics just naturally. They have to like there's a process. So what I'm looking at basically is like, how was local information actually processed? Because even the things, the perception of like a Malthusian crisis, that's a perception of local conditions, right? It's just like that was how local information was being processed at the center. So as for Matty's book, right, Matty, I think, has a very subtle take on this kind of thing. What Matty would say is, yes, there were immense difficulties with building a fiscal regime, but Matty likes Yongzheng enough to think that Yongzheng was kind of almost on the verge of succeeding and actually like rationalizing the bureaucracy at that point, right? Then you read the final chapter of her book, and she begins to ask, right after Yongzheng dies, Qianlong falls back onto the old regime, undoes his dad's most important reforms. He fails to update the tax registries. He no longer updates the Huahao quotas. Yongzheng's Huahao quota was meant to be updated once every 10 years. Qianlong never does that. So Maggie asks, then she poses the question, what made Qianlong think differently? Right, and there, because she spent so much time building up Yongzheng as an effective reformer of institutions, it's very hard to say that Yongzheng had proved the futility of trying to reform institutions. Yongzheng had actually, in her mind, I think, succeeded in reforming the institutions. So then her explanation for Qianlong necessarily is not a lack of possibility; it must be a lack of will. And so how do you then unpack the content of the will? This is where she makes her because this is not a problem with Matty. This is the very end of Matty's book. Like in a page or two, she and Bill Rowe both kind of just say these generic things. Maybe it was because of Confucian mentality, Confucian conservatism. You just drag Qianlong back into this mode where you don't want to experiment, where you don't want to do these things. And so she in the end she comes back down to some version of Confucianism that she doesn't define very clearly. So I think that's the story that Matty at least told in that book, and I read that book every single page multiple times, just as preparation for this. So I think I'm good with Matty. And then once Matty says that, right, everyone else who comes afterwards, because they don't go into this as deeply as she does. When Bill or Susan Mann write about this kind of thing, and they're just glossing over things in a way that Matty would have dealt with in a more detailed fashion, they just kind of take her knee-jerk intuition and just repeat it once in a while. The thing is, none of these guys really make explaining low taxes their priority. So they don't care too much about this. So it's like a sideshow for them. Part of this, why this book is in some ways speaking not to those guys mainly, is because the idea that this consensus that the Qing was a low tax regime is not so old, right? It's 30 years ago. You saw Catherine Bernhardt writing that lower income, peasants in the lower Yangtze were overtaxed. Or it's the emergence of like new information that we have, like from some local sources as well, that the peasantry actually was really lightly taxed. That we now have this consensus emerging amongst these different strands of people. So it wasn't really Bill or Maddie's or Susan's concern to explain this phenomenon. So they treated it in kind of like more perfunctory manner than what I have to do right now.
I received a signal from an invisible hand that we have to end now, but feel free to stay to talk with Taisu and ask your questions. Thanks a lot for your participation. We have a regular public talks, so please follow our email list or something, or I'll talk with Harry. Okay, thank you. See you some other lecture.
Thank you.